and welcome to the Leeds Digital Festival event around Specsavers entitled Our Continuous Improvement Journey. The talk will be followed by an interactive Q&A panel. Don't hesitate to ask questions all the way through. There's a little a little question thing at the bottom if you're joining on Zoom. If you're here physically, feel free to put your hand up and I'll go around with the microphone. Feel free to put comments as well if you don't want to specifically ask a question, but you do want to put a comment in. We're joined today with 4 BJSS speakers, 3 are physically here, 1's virtually, to talk about the improvements that we made in our time so far on the project. But first, we're joined by Dan Reed of Specsavers to introduce the project and explain a little bit about what we wanted to achieve when we started this engagement and when it really ramped up back in 2018. Over to you, Dan.
Thank you, Elliot, and welcome. It's good to be here. So my responsibility at Specsavers, just briefly, is for the delivery of all the digital services that we have, predominantly focused around the website and its offering for e-commerce and appointments, bookings, store pages, etc. We transitioned from our existing technology partner in 2019 over to BJSS. And in a moment, as Elliot's just said, you'll hear from these guys about the state of the technology stack and the associated processes which they inherited in doing so. You'll also hear about how they've had to tackle some very challenging changes that needed to be made in order to future-proof our systems and get us in better shape for the future, through to what we're doing today in terms of modernising our stack and our ways of working. Now, given the breadth and complexity, we worked on this in a very iterative approach. I'm a big fan of Agile. I was acutely aware that trying to do too much at once would be a bit like trying to boil the ocean. So I asked the teams to break down the work and approach it in an Agile way, obviously, in a way such that we could both improve our services, but also continue to progress delivery for our annual plan to meet our business demands and commitments that we've made during the year of the transition. So for me, during that period of time, it was very important that we were able to continue to reduce the risk of having to develop on our existing estate, which was aging at this time, whilst improving the overall performance of our delivery. So this meant not only delivering more, but making sure we delivered more on time. The caveat to that as well, of course, is that we wanted to be able to do that and scale quickly to meet peaks and troughs in business demand. But all whilst we were limited with our current technology stack that we had. So alongside that, I'd also thank, and BJSS thanked me greatly for this, but I'd made a commitment to our business that we would also provide better value for the money in which we spent in digital, ensuring that we could maximise the available spend elsewhere in the business and on the technologies that we needed to do. So quite a challenge. They inherited quite the ask, and as you'll hear now as we move over to Aidan, you can see how they started to approach this.
Cool. Thanks, Dan. So I'm going to cover the challenges and the aspirations of the project, for what the journey has been, rather than the destination. It's kind of all about the journey we've taken to get there. I'm a platform engineer at BJSS. I've been on the project since the discovery, working closely with Specsavers and Dan's team. Can I have a slide, please? Thank you. When we first joined Specsavers, they were going through the negotiations with their previous supplier to complete handover with obviously BJSS. The discovery itself was supposed to be a 12-week engagement with that previous supplier to hand over the technology, the workflows. That got reduced down to 6 weeks and then down to 4 weeks, which for a platform that's been growing for the last decade and a bit is not a lot of time. So we worked really closely with Dan's team to focus on what was key, what was needed in the next 3 months, and had to make a call based on what can be learnt, what can be discovered now versus what can we find out throughout that process over the next 3 months without too much risk involved, and really prioritize on what we needed to get out of that short handover. The environment itself is very, very complicated. There are lots and lots of moving parts, many different services, everything with a slightly different deployment pattern. And again, there's an organic growth of infrastructure that's taken place throughout that application's life cycle. Understanding the decisions that were made to build as it was now, and then what they've been trying to work through and make sure we don't lose track of any in-flight projects and in-flight pieces of work. We managed that through a lot of collaboration with that previous supplier, making sure we focus on a lot of agile delivery mechanisms and being very transparent throughout that process with Dan's team and the other suppliers. The site itself started off as a very simple portal for, hello, we're Specsavers, we sell glasses, come and see us. That was then deployed out through Specsavers' various markets, which grew to around 10 of them across various countries throughout the world. From there, they added a possibility of booking appointments, finding your local stores, finding the nearest store, booking appointments with them for contact-based and glasses-based appointments. They added the ability to purchase glasses online. From that, they added the ability to buy glasses online and virtually try on glasses. So you can go and model a pair of Specsavers frames in a 3D AR type situation, see if they fit, see if they look okay, and then continue those journeys. And then as we were getting involved, the first big things that the markets wanted to achieve were rolling out those e-com journeys to extra markets. So the intent was for 3 more markets over 2 years, rolling out audiology services and subscription-based ordering, particularly for the contact lenses. So that's a lot of change for a platform very, very organically. When we took over, the previous supplier were mid-migration. At the moment, everything was built as a hand-rolled, pointy-clicky infrastructure and configuration rather than a slightly modern infrastructure as code approach. They got to the point of rebuilding out the QA, the UAT infrastructure, but not taking it out yet into the live environments. There's multiple factors for that, mostly the increased risk. So as they were planning this out, more and more things crept in, a bit of scope creep. They're changing infrastructure, they're changing application language, major upgrades, changing additional features, which just spiraled and led to very low leadership confidence and a huge risk factor to the platform and the markets. So it was just in flight, and that was all ongoing when we took over. Which unfortunately led to a situation where live and pre-production were not anything alike, really. Which led to a bit of chaos to start with. So complex and confusing branching. Everyone knows in development, if you've got a circuitous way of releasing code and merging everyone's changes, you end up in a bit of a merge conflict hell, which we certainly found ourselves in. We found with our first couple of commits that things were being accidentally reverted, which didn't make sense. We've got siloed teams with strange documentation that doesn't match sort of siloed and hive knowledge. A team knows things done like that, but the documentation says it's done like this. The new team onboarding does it like this, not like everyone else knows it should be done, which led to a lot of confusion and a lot of drift from documentation. That combined with final commits from the outgoing supplier with the first set of commits from BJSS devs led to what is not an uncommon situation in this sort of thing where you've got 2 different vendors. But it's just very difficult to manage. It's one that we see every now and then, but we know that it can work with multiple supplier teams. You then got that legacy hive knowledge problem, which onboarding with a very, very short window exacerbates, and then you find things are just not as they were intended to be and they don't match up with reality, which again leads to more difficulty, more discovery, and ultimately a lot of tech debt. First things we did were change that branching tagging strategy. Often a solid base for how you release code and how you get that out into production levels can improve stability, confidence, and speed just as much as general development practices can. We found integrating ourselves with Specsavers change management, InfoSec teams, architectural teams, and other parts of the business units throughout Specsavers led to much better awareness of what's going on in that digital web space for Specsavers. And when COVID hit, we were already integrated with a lot of those business functions that went from relying on store data to the website being effectively the only store. And them already being integrated with us meant there were a lot less friction than could possibly have been there. It meant everyone knew where everything was and who to contact for everything, which was really nice. From a technical perspective, a couple of really important things we did. The first one was we introduced a mechanism by which we had a nightly build of all the code. Anything ready for release, built on a nightly basis, allowed for much faster testing, meant the business units could see the work that they'd invested and got stakes in on a much faster cadence, which is really good. We improved the speed for all the UAT and QA builds by like 300% by introducing a lot of dry practices, a lot of parallelization, and just streamlining in general. From that, we started building out a comprehensive automation test framework, focusing really heavily on regression packs and sort of dynamic journey-based testing. So running through the website, buy some glasses, running through the website, buying contacts, running through again, placing bookings for various types of glasses or audiology bookings, things like that, making sure those key customer focused journeys were working as expected. Finally, for me, is lessons learned. So we know that embedded development practices don't transfer too well. So this is like a verbal transfer of how we release code. It's never going to stand up to a lot of scrutiny, particularly when you're breaking out of those silos and those known sort of hive mind development situations. Handovers can't cover everything. The shorter ones cover even less. So the shorter the handover session is with the previous supplier, the less can be known. And balancing that against risks and delivery priorities was really important to us, and especially Dan and his team. Inbound and outbound team code really being mixed increases risk, and increases risk a lot. We know working with other clients within BJSS that mixed development teams can absolutely work. It relies on a lot of collaboration, a lot of transparency, making sure that's all the focus of everything is key. A lot of the business processes evolve around previous risks, and to combat those by controlling and eliminating the risks that occurred in the first place to create that process through a much more iterative and agile work stream can help remove a lot of those previous bits of bureaucracy that need to be completed, and reducing again the risk to the business, the confidence the business has, and making sure everything is a lot smoother. Finally, it was a very difficult transition. There's a lot of business trust and support from Dan and his team just to do the right thing from a BJSS perspective. And we were able to manage expectations, make sure we deliver, and make sure we start evolving that service out to the future. Luke's going to cover the industrial age effectively, where we started to realize the improvements we could make throughout that platform. So I'll hand over to Luke Jones. Luke, it's all yours.
Thank you, Aidan. Yes, so for those of you who don't know me, I'm Luke Jones. So I'm a software developer at BJSS. Originally was based in Leeds, so where you guys are right now, or most of you are right now, and then moved to Lisbon in December. So it's a little bit of an international flavour to the talk today, which is cool. And like Aidan said, I'm going to talk about really the transition out of those dark ages. And I think it's fair to say really that transition began with a project that we call the Netherlands Glasses. So this was bringing the glasses e-commerce journey to the Netherlands market. Previously only existed in Australia. And this was really the first real test, I guess, for the Specs and BJS teams to deliver something new. So this is our code rather than their code. And it was happening, in parallel to a lot of that transitional work as well. So it really was, how are the teams going to work? How are we going to build on top of this inherited code base and actually deliver something? How are we going to work over the next few years? It was going to be the first of 3 e-com deliveries. So there was further 2 markets being the UK and Sweden coming up after that. And so really it's important that, we hit the ground running and didn't have to spend a lot of time sort of bogged down with the quagmire of all the transitional work. I think it's fair to say that this was a real forming stage for BJSS and Specsavers. So there were a lot of gaps around, ways of working within the teams and across the teams. We were working remotely a lot of that time. So Specs down in Southampton, BJSS in Leeds, and just finding our feet with that relationship. There were a lot of technical misunderstandings, flawed assumptions, misalignments, ways of dovetailing with the release teams and managed services. It was all just, new stuff and quite fresh. But we did learn an absolute ton, which is always the way it's sometimes sort of in the deep end and out the other side. So from my point of view as a cell lead, alongside obviously the core technical changes that were going on at that time, a real high percentage of my effort went on process change, really. So that was really understanding how the previous vendor was taking code from inception to production, and how we want to do that in a non-breaking way, really. So a lot of it was around documentation and so on. The output of that initial sort of process mapping was a fairly concise Confluence page, but it did make an enormous it did have an enormous effect on the teams. So it's famously titled the Crash Bandicoot Sprint Workflow, which is the name of our team at the time. And it just helped people to really understand what was going on. It was a real big project. There were so many moving parts. Everything felt quite fuzzy, especially how interactions happen between the individual cells and releasing software. And just having that page of a sort of concrete flow really helped us, provide a base on which we could improve and automate and iterate on over the next few years. I think it's fair to say that by most metrics, the Netherlands Glasses delivery was a real success, but we did know there was a lot of stuff we could improve on. There was a lot of work to do, and certainly to ensure we could meet the upcoming challenges of 2020. I've just picked out a couple of those things. There are certainly more that we could discuss. The big ones for me, looking back at configuration. So obviously Specsavers is a multinational company. At the time we were involved, they had an online presence in 10 different countries. And it is one application that's deployed, sort of 10 times. And there's a hell of a lot of config around that, as you can imagine, over the years on a mature and sort of aging platform. There's also a lot of market specific code paths as well. And this was a real engineering minefield for us, to be quite honest. We were trying to release out to market after market, and just finding ticking time bombs sat in the code, in the configuration. Especially it being an inherited project, there wasn't always an expert or someone who could explain the config in tons and tons of detail. So we did lose a lot of time there, but it was an investment that we knew we needed to make. So breaking down that config, removing superfluous configuration, simplifying it, removing market sort of code paths and turning them into feature code paths so we could turn on and off for the other markets. And we also spent a lot of time scripting configuration, which sounds like a really obvious step, but it was just something that we were losing a lot of time to. So there was a lot of people waking up at 5 AM to do manual steps to set the release up right. And so where we could, we tried to script that. And it is important to say, even if you can't do, the full-blown sort of infrastructure as code solution, you can take lots of steps in the right direction, and it's important to start rather than aim for perfection. The test coverage was low as well, so that's worth shouting about. Obviously, it made developers reluctant to make scary code changes or code changes in fairly crucial parts of the code base. And it was the point really in time where we started to make inroads into our automated test framework, where we started to bring the devs and the engineers that bit closer together and really emphasize tests as a sort of first-class citizen on the project. And then we went live with our second market, which really would only have been possible because of those investments that we made. We felt we were really positioned for the next set of deliveries. We'd sort of done the 2 of 3, we felt really strong. And then there was the sort of minor matter of a huge international pandemic, which took us obviously back a little bit. That was a stage of huge reaction, adaptation, a lot of working from uncomfortable parts of the house. I spent a lot of time in the attic personally, very warm and very bad air cooling. And obviously during that time, it isn't just a matter of doing more Zoom calls, right? There's a lot of stuff that was easy, that was quite seamless. There's a lot of stuff that was really difficult. So the technical whiteboarding, a lot of the ceremonies just felt harder at first without that sort of face-to-face interaction. And even just the simple stuff of speaking to colleagues side of desk and picking their brains on a particular implementation or solution. So as well as us finding our feet, it had an enormous impact on Specsavers. They're obviously a huge retail organization, they've got a very big high street presence, and in lockdown that pretty much went away for a brief period of time. And the emphasis really became, how do we get an e-commerce solution out for as many markets as possible, as quickly as possible? This is a real major business risk now if we can't do this fast enough. So we had a discussion about what we could do. Could we do more markets? How many more? How quickly? And our confidence was pretty high. It wouldn't have been possible without that previous investment in ripping out config, simplifying config, building at least some basic automated tests to give confidence. And we did manage to get, a pretty phenomenal amount of work done, really, relative to the initial plan. So it says here, the pre-pandemic plan was 3 countries over 2 years. And at our sort of peak productivity, we actually delivered 5 countries in 3 months, which is, crazy, really. And if you'd have asked anyone on the team, sort of at the project inception, they would have probably laughed at that, really, and just told you it was never going to happen. Important points in that time or takeaways: if something seems like a waste of time, it probably is. Can it be automated? Where are you getting a lot of noise from? Where are all your bug reports coming from? What do you spend so much time talking about? Can something be fixed, made more robust? Can you wrap a test around it? Can you streamline meetings or do them asynchronously? Can you document answers to frequently asked questions? Can you publicize information better? All those sorts of questions are things that you never get round to them, but actually they pay huge dividends, really. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to just call out a few of those. It's not an exhaustive list, but some that I think a lot of projects could look into if they're not doing already. So yeah, tedious JIRA admin. So there's the Specsavers release process, at least in the sort of existing platform, is quite involved. There are a lot of stakeholders. There are a lot of things that need to be checked. There are a lot of risks and therefore mitigation of those risks. There's a lot of dual entry happening. And we really just felt a lot of this stuff could be done without someone sat there adding labels and, checking that the person's updated test evidence and all this stuff. So we began to look at JIRA automation. It is quite a sophisticated no-code tool. It does bring a little bit of joy back to JIRA, at least if you've got that sort of technical slant as well. So encourage everyone to look at that if that's an option available. Don't incorporate people into deployment and release pipelines unless you can avoid it. So like I said earlier, we had a lot of 5 a.m. People waking up at 5 a.m. to help with post deploys or pre-deploys and things like that, and just configuring the system. And a lot of those could be automated, and a lot of the time it was actually really simple to do so. So think about that. It not only has a risk in that it can be done consistently across environments and releases, obviously, but it also just weighs on your people as well, right? No one likes doing that. It's risky, it feels pressured, and it often happens out of hours. Get some automation testing as well. Again, this is, don't let perfection be the enemy of good. Start small, but do start. We did start during this Netherlands and Glasses e-com rollouts. It paid huge returns for us. And I think as well, on the human side, it gives you more time to do the stuff that's worthwhile. So identifying where the areas of improvement were, where are the bug reports coming from, where is the team unhappy, and what are they unhappy doing. We were all working on a big monolithic application. We weren't always coordinating as effectively as we could be. If you're rolling code together, deploying it together, you really want to be coordinating as early as you can, and engaging and talking about dependencies. And really, it seems basic stuff when you spell it out, but in heated delivery, a lot of these things can go unless there's a little bit of a robust process and a sort of culture around it. And then finally, make information self-serve. So don't do a lot of message passing. If you can sort of publicize that more widely, can you share it? Can you just point people to a page? Again, it sounds really straightforward, but it's quite surprising how many times people will answer the same question and sort of waste their time or potentially giving consistent answers. So yeah, sort of emphasizing that self-serve attitude is really crucial. And then finally, I think the best thing, or the greatest takeaway for me on the project, was that this industrial age, it wasn't cutting edge, right? It wasn't, we weren't really breaking any technical boundaries, but we had cultivated this continuous improvement culture. We've proven that without making tons and tons of technical changes, we could actually deliver much more rapidly, and that was sort of proven during the pandemic. after the first few tweaks are made, it's really surprising how much more confident everyone gets at suggesting new ideas and implementing them. So, you know, the first year automation might have been a bit scary. The second one was less scary. And by the time we'd done 3 or 4 people, it was a real ideas generation factory. You know, people were thinking, can we do it this way, can we do it that way? It's not just a Jira automation issue, obviously, but more of a cultural thing. Not all solutions are technical. So some of them were certainly around configuration and testing. A lot of them were just making sure we knew who the right people to speak were, making sure people spending their time on the right thing, and encouraging people to speak up and make changes, however small they are. Automation of tasks, again, a great one, but it's often the second step once you understand how you should be doing something. It's hard to automate something where you don't understand the baseline. So just capturing how the cells should work with the release team and dovetail into the other parts of the business is crucial, and especially on a project of that size with reasonably pressing demand. We had the greater ambitions, so the industrial age wasn't where we wanted to stop. We sort of moved out of the Luddite phase, but we knew we could do more. We started to see the beginning of the automation testing framework and what that could do, and robustness and protection that could give. And we brought the dev and test team closer together, so we had the sort of engineering mindset rather than the sort of siloed mentality. And we'd really started to look at release frequency and what we would do in an ideal world to move closer to much quicker releases, which would be better for us in terms of risk, but better for Specsavers in terms of a business. And a lot of those lessons would form part of the next wave of projects in the atomic and information age, which Dan and Stuart are going to talk about. So I'll hand over to Dan now.
Thank you. My name's Dan, the second Dan on the project, and I've been working with the Find and Book team, which is revolved around the online booking system, for just about 2 years nearly, so kind of from the inception of as BJSS took over. Cool. So what is Fab? So yeah, Fab is the team which developed the online booking platform for Specsavers. And after we released eCom to what seems like the world, our attention then changed onto the next piece of work, which was replatforming the Find and Book kind of system. This was a kind of a greenfield project, which involved rewriting the front end in a new framework and also migrating the back end from AWS over to Azure, to bring about, to reduce the release cadence down from monthly down to hourly, as Stuart's going to talk about later. As it was a new project, we did kind of have freedom to do what we wanted from a ways of working perspective. But as Luke's just described in the kind of industrial age, we'd already set about those kind of learnings and new ways of working, so we didn't want to kind of start from scratch. As we did discover, though, these new ways of working did bring about some new challenges that I'll discuss later. So what works currently and what did we do to change? So as I just mentioned, we already had some established patterns and how we wanted to work. I was basically bringing together the kind of dev and the test and really kind of bringing about working towards the DevOps mentality. As a test engineer, the kind of the first and probably most important part of this new piece of work was bringing a test first mentality. So rather than leaving the testing all to the end of the development cycle and leaving it to manual testing, which was a prevalent way of testing on the previous project, it was fully focused on automation testing and getting that, crucially, that kind of early feedback to the developers and to the business as a whole about any changes that we were making, to making sure we weren't kind of regressing anywhere. Again, accessibility considerations were integrated across the work streams. This is kind of a departure from the retrofit model, where normally accessibility is unfortunately left to last and sometimes doesn't make it out to the website. But crucially, what we as a team all kind of got behind was making accessibility a main kind of acceptance criteria of any features we were developing, and we would kind of fail a story or a piece of work if those accessibility considerations weren't met. So onto some of the challenges that we faced, which are interesting, and we did kind of resolve them. They're bringing down the whole dev test divide. So one of the things we wanted to do was enable the team members as a whole to kind of feel empowered to get involved in development work or test automation work. This meant that we were able to kind of speed up delivery. There was no kind of to and fro and back and forth within the development team, sorry. I kind of really advocated this kind of symbiotic kind of relationship between everyone on the team. Not only that, it empowered, well, it upskilled basically each member of the team. So we all learned new abilities and new way of coding or a new skill that we hadn't previously had in our professional lives. And that meant that the team could kind of deliver what it needed to because we all had a wide skill set rather than the amount of work that we could only do if we had a limited amount of skills within the team. Test automation takes time. One of the biggest downsides of kind of, I guess, retrofitting automation onto a code base is that you're not really, well, it takes time and you have to start from the basics. And that's what we were kind of doing in the industrial age, was retrofitting the automation framework around the current code base that we had. So what we did for Find and Book, we developed a kind of atomic design principle where both the development code and the automation code were working together using the same kind of design system. So whenever some development code was merged in, we would kind of the mirror image of that would be set in the automation framework. So it was slow to start off with from a delivery perspective, setting up all the different kind of components and setting up the foundations of that framework. And again, this atomic design was a new way of engineering solutions. So it's a steep learning curve for all of the engineers involved. But it did create a culture of shared ownership between the developers and the test automators, or engineers, as we call them. So basically, the developers were working alongside the test automation engineers. So any pain that they would cause, not on purpose, by accident normally, we'd all be involved in fixing the test automation. So it would be in everyone's best interest to kind of work together and create the best, highest quality code. Similarly, from the test automation, we built a kind of shared component library in the development code. Likewise, it was a slow delivery initially because you had to set up all these different kind of building or the foundations for the component library from scratch. One of the main, I guess, pros of having this was that the components that were built already had the tests built into them. So we'd know that, you know, if we were using a component in one part of the code base, we'd know that it should be working exactly the same way in another part, and also the test had already been set up and running. So there's no need to duplicate any kind of code from a development or an automation perspective. One of the challenges that we faced was how versatile or how granular would we make these components. We knew that any code that we would be working on in the Find and Book space, in the work stream, would be eventually used across the whole estate once the e-com kind of side of the business came online. So it's difficult for us to kind of really understand that level of how much time and effort do we spend on developing this piece of code, or this component now, to say how much time would it then take another developer or a team in the future in another part of the web page to then unpick that, or basically have to rewrite the code themselves and duplicate it. So there's a lot of refactoring, kind of tweaking here and there to understand how we would want, to what level we'd want to develop the components. And this is an odd challenge, delivery at pace. So once we'd kind of got the foundation set for within the delivery team, we soon started burning through all of the work to be done, which had been kind of brought forward for the development team to do. So one of the odd challenges that we didn't expect to have was we were kind of running out of work. And one of the ways to kind of solutionize this was basically having more agile sessions, more 3 amigos, and also having informed stakeholders. So we'd have kind of product owners who were regularly speaking with the teams, who understood the kind of the model that we were creating and the work that we had to do. So we quickly and agilely develop more stories ready to keep feeding the teams. But sometimes working at pace does tend to lead to a kind of downturn in quality. So one way of combating this is basically that we would have retros every 2 weeks, internally in our team and also within the kind of the project as a whole, to keep kind of talking and understanding how we could basically keep it fresh and having new perspectives all the time. And one of the kind of outputs of one of these retros was that because the teams in Find and Book were working from the same code base, we could basically pull in different engineers from different teams and have their kind of say on and invite them to the kind of reviews of our code and keep it fresh and keep having different perspectives on the work that we're doing, to keep because if you're working in a close kind of knit type of group of people, you do tend to miss some of the not more obvious but kind of minute details that other people might pick up. So to conclude, what makes Fab fabulous? So automate. Automation is a big part of the work we do. Ideally, it creates this kind of fast feedback loop within the team, but it also allows us to kind of work on the continuous delivery system that Stuart's going to talk about in a second. Consolidate, having an atomic design methodology. So from the designs to the development code to the automation code, it was the same language and same methodology. So we weren't kind of having different models in our heads of how it might work. Everyone understood exactly how it should be working. So allowed us to streamline delivery and have a high quality code base. Communicating and collaborating. Like I said, we knocked down the dev test divide, enabling the engineers to kind of work on any pieces of work, to upskill themselves, also to increase the delivery of the features we're developing. Evaluating, continually kind of retrospectively, self-analysis, so we could identify any issues that we had. So we're continually improving and making sure any sticky points were seen, ironed out. And emancipate, so giving the team more freedom on what they can do means that the business can have more freedom in what they can kind of prioritize and push forward as we move on to the future of Find and Book. And I'll now hand over to Stuart, who will talk about the continuous deployment that we're going to be doing on Find and Book.
Thank you, Daniel. Hi, so my name's Stuart Bass. I'm a technical architect at BJSS, and I was brought into this project really to help work out how we are going to deploy the system, moving over from AWS into Azure, and also moving to use Azure DevOps as the key kind of tool of choice for delivering all these things. I suppose while Dan's talked about the particular team, I'm going to talk about the wider program as a whole and how we tried to enable bringing continuous deployment, moving from sort of a monthly release cadence to multiple releases a day through to Specsavers. So I'm just going to kick off with kind of a summary of the ask, really. So in terms of the business, we needed to manage multiple releases throughout the day without downtime. Essentially, we need to do that across all the markets around the world, which by now has grown from 10 to 12, I think. We've got a single code base that we're deploying everything from. So we need to test to make sure that everything's working across all those markets. Whilst we've been doing this, we've also had to support, now we're running about 10 Scrum teams in different areas across this particular area, all working, developing and testing in parallel. And that's also had to kind of sit alongside the existing platform so that we can gradually migrate piece by piece, one from the other as it's ready to go across. At a technical level, we've had to move to use Azure DevOps for code, build and deploy. That was kind of the Specsavers standard, and it's a pretty good tool that I've been familiar with for a long time. The principal deployment of that is into Azure, and we had to follow a whole series of company standards for that. Azure is their key kind of platform going forwards. We've also had to work with a variety of SaaS products. So in general, the sort of architectural picture was if there's a SaaS product that does something, we should use that instead of building something ourselves. And the main sort of languages are Java and JavaScript for development. So we had to make sure that all our build pipelines worked across both those things. So just going to pause for a second, just talk a little bit about what is continuous deployment. Really, when people talk about this stuff, you'll see this in all kinds of lectures around this. There's sort of 3 stages. You begin here on the left with continuous integration, where every change into your repositories. First of all, you're putting code into a repository, and you're not just pushing from a developer's machine into production. You're putting things into a repository. All those changes are then being collated, built, and checked in some way individually. The next stage up from this is a bit of a leap, and that's continuous delivery, where you're checking everything, and every merge into main, everything that's there is theoretically deployable to production. Now, you might be choosing not to do that for business reasons. You might want to do things out of hours or whatever it is. But there's a big jump from one to the other, because that means that everything in that branch, in that place, is ready to go. And the final stage is essentially where you take the human out of the equation for that decision about whether it's ready to go or not. And you're continuously pushing every change through that's been approved and checked and tested into production, so it's just happening. That's sort of where we're aiming to get. And we're just going to talk you through the process that we're going to use to get there, or are using to get there. So this begins really with having a system architecture that's designed for doing this. It'd be much more difficult to try and do this using some of the technologies that we inherited. So I got laughs from right at me when I said that. So one of the things so the BJSS architect team worked very closely with the Specsavers team, came up with this new kind of infrastructure system architecture to go out. It's essentially a micro front end, micro back end system. So there's lots of different individual little front end applications representing different parts of the website. These are all built statically using Vue Nux. It's a very, very fast static web app framework. And these are all built and configured out separately for each market. The back end similarly gets deployed out, is broken up into little pieces, and those pieces are all brought together using GraphQL and GraphQL querying. So there's a single GraphQL gateway that bridges the gap between all the different back-end services. There's also an event infrastructure there to pass events between different things where it's needed. And finally, there's lots of integration back into SaaS products. I'm particularly calling out here, we use commerce tools a lot in the back end, and that's got some great configuration tools around it using Terraform. We've also got Cloudflare at the front for the web requests coming in, and we're using ForgeRock for authentication. So the next one, having got like the architecture or the view of where we wanted to get to in place to allow this process, we had quite a lot of sessions really talking through how we can actually create a nice flat route to live to get these changes through fast. This is sort of where we ended up. We came to the decision that there were 3 kinds of deliveries that we've got. There's an inconsequential delivery, which I'm going to talk through here in a sec, which is basically a small change confined to a single component. So something like I text change the website. That's a small change. The next kind of size up is a standard delivery where you might have multiple changes together that you need to make together to push things out, but those changes are kind of constrained within the digital space itself. And then finally, we have a major delivery, which is really where we're starting to impact external systems to us. We're bringing on new functionality that's requiring speaking to some new services that require extra testing at the system level to make sure everything's going. I'm just briefly going to talk through this route to live. It begins with build. This will be familiar to most people. We've got things in here like static analysis, so we send things to SonarQube to make sure the code looks okay. We've got unit tests in there, obviously checking things like unit test coverage and so on. The next bit of terminology we're using here is component tests, and this is where we essentially stand up the individual component by itself as a black box, put mocks around it and automatically test against it. Assuming that's all good as well, we've then got contract tests. So this applies in certain situations to make sure that your clients aren't using APIs in ways that they're not expecting. APIs aren't being changed in a way that breaks the way the clients are using them. So we use something called PACT for contract testing in certain places around. And Dan's already mentioned accessibility tests. And we also run performance tests in parallel for each of the individual front ends to make sure that we're hitting some of the core metrics. In particular sort of around the Google metrics. Having built that, I made sure that the component's okay. The next step really is we stand up a dynamic environment. So this means we stand up a complete copy of the environment as it is at present in production, and we put in this new component with its new version and its changing, and from there we can then run the automated integration tests. Can run performance tests against it if we want to. You can do manual tests against it. You can demo it to stakeholders. And this dynamic environment really is key to the whole process. It's really important that any kind of testing that you need to be able to do, you can do here. Because this ultimately the next stage, the approval stage, this is your gateway into production. So you need to be really happy with this change. All the different stakeholders need to have approved it. In the case of an inconsequential delivery, it's most likely going to be a developer, a tester, possibly the product owner. Once they're all happy and it's approved, this is all done on a pull request where we gather all the feedback from these different processes. Once that's approved, it's merged, and once it's in main, it's going to production. So it goes into main, it then gets deployed out into a staging environment. There's smoke tests run, automatic tests just to make sure it's okay, and then same again through into production. So if that's an inconsequential delivery, a standard or a major delivery really follow the same sort of process. There's just more approvals needed before you finally switch it on. Essentially, this is a series of inconsequential changes. First of all, we create a feature flag. Then that's an inconsequential change. You make multiple changes behind that toggle, keeping everything hidden, but continually redeploying those changes, keeping everyone in line so there's not too much drift. Then once everyone's happy with that change, and depending on whether it's a standalone or major delivery, depends on how many people need to look at it, what tests are you need to do, then we switch that toggle on, it then becomes visible. And then subsequently, once you're happy with that, you don't want to back it out, you then get rid of anything that's left hanging around, you take out the flag, and that's now your new main thing that you're working. And anyone I think who's worked with feature flags knows it's really important to take them back out again. Otherwise it becomes pretty unmanageable pretty fast. In terms of environment structure, what we do is we've got a deliberately simple flat structure. We've got a development subscription where developers can poke and test and do different things. I think it's one of the other really important things here. Dan talked about the dev test divide. We've really tried to bridge the dev test platform divide. Everything all the way through from the infrastructure to the code is all managed, released and deployed in the same way. And the development teams can come in, adjust environment variables, adjust different things that they need, particularly when we're adding things like around the eventing infrastructure without really platform needing to do anything other than just approve and make sure they've met the standards. Through into, then we've got a QA environment. This is where the bulk of our work happens. Here we spin up all these multiple dynamic environments where people can do all their testing. And when we spin up an environment, we're not talking just about, say, a little bit like GB for this. We spin up everything. We spin up all the markets, everything that we need to test to make sure that it works before we can say that this code change is okay to go in. we also do blue-green deployment throughout this to maintain availability. And I think I said this before, all the testing needs to be possible in this dynamic environment, because this is your key gate for getting things through out into production. Once it flows out and goes into main, it gets automatically retested in staging just to check we've done all configuration switches and things like that, okay? And then on into production. The only other kind of stop approval gate is there will be is essentially an approval stage between staging and production, whereby everything automatically goes through, but someone from support can press a red button to stop it. And obviously, if there's some sort of P1 kind of issue going on in production, you just want to stop the flow of change while you work out what's going on before you then can restart the train and have everything going back in again. Technically underneath this, we've used Azure DevOps throughout. Everything's based on kind of GitOps processes. So every versionable deployable component, so all of each front end, each back end, each piece has its own repository. Each one of those is independently versioned using semantic versioning and conventional commit standards. So we've got automatic version tracking throughout everything to put everything together. All of that is then combined into each kind of stream or area of work, has its own Terraform repo, and every branch on this repo is an environment. So the component, when a PR is raised, when it comes to create a dynamic environment, it creates a branch on the Terraform repository that creates the environment, and all the things then chain together. So the other key rule really is if we've got two branches of the same name anywhere around our system, that's all deployed to the same environment. And that allows you to check multiple things together before they all go. Yeah, and everything is managed this way. So it's not just application code. We use Terraform, we build out all the Azure infrastructure. We also, wherever we can, try and use this process to manage out applications, configuration of SaaS products. So we use Terraform to configure Cloudflare, to configure commerce tools. I'm just going to finish up with some statistics on this. It's quite interesting. So as of when I took these numbers, which I think was Friday, Saturday, so I had 97 test environments. That's 97 bits of parallel work undergoing essentially review testing across all the 10 teams. That day, we'd had 22 kind of production ready deployments all going in and going through. So that's 22 test environments getting destroyed. And when we're deploying things in here at the moment, we've got 18 different things being deployed out. And that number's only increasing as the teams kind of ramp up and plow through their work. The chart on the left just kind of shows how long our environments are lasting. So you can see in the last 30 days, I had 60 test environments which lasted less than a day, which means that change came in, was reviewed, was okayed, and went straight in within a day, which was really good. Obviously, just kind of tails off the numbers until you get to the end. We've obviously got some things which are running on a bit. But it's worth pointing out, I suppose, that at the moment with the monthly release cadence, everything's in the right-hand column in the existing platform. So this is all a lot faster than it was. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Elliot, who's going to handle questions. Thank you very much.
Hey, yeah, so we've got a couple of questions in the Q&A panel. I'll try and direct those accordingly. Sorry if you're looking for me on the video. I'm going to try and run around the room as well to see if there's anyone that has any questions that wants to raise their hand. I'll start with that first, and then we'll move into the written questions in the Q&A panel. Is there anyone in the room that wants to shove their hand up? Cool, I'll move over.
Thank you. First off, great presentation. You've sort of spoken through the ages here, and I'd like to know on this continuous improvement journey. Luke mentioned that you sat down and you envisioned this sort of ideal world. Now that you're kind of here, what's next on this continuous improvement journey? And is there any sort of one thing you're looking for that you've got on your sites?
Is that for me? I think that we're not there yet. We've got little bits to finish off on the process, and I think that then the next thing really is to, like I put some statistics up at the end, monitoring and information about these whole processes is really important. Yeah, it'd be lovely to get those times for change being reviewed down across the board. I'd love I had to go and pull those numbers out. We need to have automation around pulling those kinds of metrics out of the system. I think really that's the case. It's just iterative improvements area. Having watched over a release happening last night, because at the moment we're still just releasing in the early morning while we're just putting our feet in the water with this process. There's some things we can do to speed up the deployment process, because to my mind it takes too long. It takes about 15 minutes to deploy an environment at the moment, which is to my mind too long, maybe not to everybody else.
From my perspective as a kind of within the development team, we're very much just focusing on kind of find and book at the moment. So these processes that we're kind of developing is very much working for us. So what's next is probably making those processes, moving those processes onto the other cells and other work streams within the website, and kind of seeing those blossom and then kind of learning from them and see how they learn. And kind of, hopefully bringing those lessons learned back into our work stream.
Very similar for us. A lot of the stuff that Stuart's team are doing now was things that me and my team thought about sort of nearly 2 years ago with Dan, and what we'd like to see out for Specsavers in the future. So it's really lovely seeing a lot of that come into its fruition. There's obviously a lot of things to do still, as Stuart said, but a lot of these practices and things are what we said we needed to achieve back then, and seeing that happen is really nice.
Yeah, I'll jump in as well. So I guess one thing I'm really keen to achieve in the next sort of 6 months to a year or whatever is so Stuart showed the graph of the time between or how long sort of environment lives. But also it'd be really nice to bring the time at which a developer is developing and merging it in. So we're aiming to do sort of strict CI and get things merged by everyone every day. We're not there yet. We need there'll be a learning curve on feature toggling and other sort of techniques for sort of merging in DOM code and things like that. So I think that's going to be the next probably few challenges.
Cool. I'll jump to one of the questions that's in the Q&A, and this is going to be another one for everyone, I'm afraid, which is, has there been one improvement that is the most important, or is it actually the combination of everything?
Yeah, it's quite difficult because there's so much stuff going in throughout the platform. I mean, certainly for us, a lot of the improvements were around how we redefine the sort of the release process itself and make it much more resilient and really, really lower the risk that a release has to the business. So we can make sure that everything that's going in is critical and is really well tested for those key journeys that the site has. We need to be 100% sure that we're not breaking things like the glasses purchase journey, the contacts purchase journey, and the booking purchase journey. And with a legacy, very organically grown code base, the level of risk around those things is always really high. And getting that in and getting that sorted very, very early on, I think was really key to at least the older legacy bits of the code base. I think Luke can probably speak to that, I think, more than I can as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of the, like in the industrial edge to say like that with branching model and the scripting of config and just pulling out configuration, like they're the things that just jump out at me as to what made the biggest difference. And then, yeah, understanding the processes both within the cell and across the release of the software were major, because we just seemed like we were firefighting for a little bit until we pinned that.
For me, it'll be moving the test to the start, more towards the left of the development cycle, so we get kind of fast feedback. It's been a great help for the whole team, and hopefully once we start releasing, it'll enable us to very much bring down that release cadence to where we want to be.
I don't know if there's any one single thing. I think it's just been a combination of continuous iterative improvement. The conventional commit standard and the way that we build, manage, and push things out. Getting that into each component's iteratively building and doing all those different steps that we had. That's a huge milestone in making sure its components right. Having all those environments spinning up and standing down, that took some effort. And I think the final jump that we're making right now is finishing off all the maintaining live with blue-green switching, And we brought in quite a lot of improvements to our internal kind of configuration management process there, which has really helped us push that out. And it's quite interesting that other teams within Specsavers are also starting to use the same process as well.
Anything to add to yourself, Dan?
Well, obviously not technically, that's what you guys do. Probably the biggest improvement and the main one was transitioning to BJSS in the first place. So that's what sparked the journey. And I think it's worth saying as well that I have no doubt the teams could have done more quickly, but we had to temper that with a finite budget and spend against new demand that had to keep going alongside this. So we tread a path very carefully around a risk-adverse approach, but also trying to make headway. So I think, I think compromise is the biggest improvement we've made, and that built out the trust and the confidence in making those changes, which I know is the other question in the chat, but that was really the convincer for me, was seeing the changes make a difference and then investing in further change.
Yeah, so Dan's alluded to the final question in the chat there, which is, it sounds like there was a few challenges convincing everyone that the changes were good, and how did we approach that? And how do you convince teams that the improvements are worthwhile fighting for? I know Luke's raised his hand to answer that, and Dan's already given a little bit, but that's the final question, so I'll hand over to Luke.
Cool. I just had the church bells going off there as well for a bit of extra drama. Yeah, so I guess there definitely was inertia, right? And there's a lot of risk to manage. So that was the first thing, especially around releases. I think one approach we had was to, it's an incremental series of things rather than a big parallelization of tons of changes. Don't do big bang essentially on process or technical changes where possible. Also spent a little bit of time piloting or de-risking it by having one cell or one portion of the project try something. So in the case of the new sort of team workflow, rather than have everyone dive into it, have one team do it, show how the improvements and efficiencies grow. And actually, when we did that, we didn't need to speak to the teams and say, you should use this process. They sort of saw it and said, yeah, that does seem like it's working, and we'd have to reinvent the wheel. So, often it's more sort of come up with something good that works for you and let people know about it, and then they'll make their own decision, and often they want the same thing or similar thing. Yeah, and I think it wasn't really a massive task to convince people. It was just showing them that little things had worked before building up to bigger things. So that's how it felt at the time. I don't think we would have walked in on day one and said we want to change 500 things and anyone would have said yes. So, similar to Dan's answer there.
Anyone else? Anything else to add?
It's pretty complete.
Cool. Well, thank you to everyone for joining today. Appreciate your time, and sorry that the Q&A section has overrun slightly. But yeah, thank you very much for attending, and hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to reach out and ask us any questions that you didn't ask in the chat. Cheers.